To each and every one of you. It's my great joy and privilege to introduce our speaker for this morning, and certainly we just appreciate him coming to share with us in the thought of partnering in ministry. Dr. Rod Marshall is the president and CEO of the Alabama Baptist Children's Home and Family Ministries. He's a licensed counselor. He has served the Alabama Baptist Children's Home and Family Ministries for more than 20 years in various capacities. He's well credentialed, and we just thank God for him. He's a graduate of Sanford University with a degree in religion and human relations. He received his master's degree from the University of Alabama, his PhD from Regent University. He is married, and he has 2 adult children, wonderful grandchildren, and he enjoys going down to the Emerald Coast from time to time where he grew up. We're delighted to have Dr. Rod Stewart to come. Would you greet him and show your love and appreciation?
Thank you very much. What a privilege it is to be here with you today and talk about a topic that I've spent a lot of time thinking about lately, strengths and ministry. You know, I get calls from several pastors, and sometimes the call I get is from a pastor who's discouraged, and a pastor who doesn't understand why things are not working. Oftentimes the pastor's calling because they want advice on how to make a career shift. They're not sure the pastorate is going to work for them any longer. And because I'm a licensed professional counselor, they want to know what they would have to do to get that credential and explore another career opportunity. I think what happens sometimes is there are several factors that have to come together on a church staff to maximize our effectiveness and minimize the potential for burnout. The first of those is a good job fit. You know, there's some people who are good people that are in a position that's not a good position for them to be in. And they may never feel fulfilled if they're working in a position that's just not a good fit. And so at the children's home every year, we rewrite our job descriptions to make sure the job description accurately reflects what the job is and what the expectations are for the next 12 months. So people know what their job is. And oftentimes, if you look over a 10, 15, 20-year track, the job that someone's doing is pretty different than the job they were hired to do. So trying to make sure that remains a good fit for your employees. Secondly, I think it's valuable to have conversations about what are your core values. And I encourage those to be core values from a secular perspective, because if we ask what our core values are from a religious perspective, we know the answer. Even if that answer is what we learned in Vacation Bible School or Sunday school and not something we've really thought about and internalized. But what are your core values, and what would your core values be if you weren't serving in a ministry setting? For instance, I'll tell you mine. I have 3 vocational core values. I want to pursue excellence, I want to innovate solutions, and I want to have fun. And whenever possible, I want to do all 3 of those things at the same time. That's what I would be doing if I was a college professor. That's what I would be doing if I was a salesman somewhere. That's what I would be doing if I owned my own business. And that's what I want to do in the ministry where I'm employed. Those values are essential to me. I can't change them much. Next, I want to know what people's calling is, both globally and focally. My global calling is to take care of fatherless children. I have felt a strong calling for that most of my adult life. But in my role at the children's home, I don't have much contact with the children. I do have the opportunity to empower and equip the folks who do have contact with the children. So my focal calling is to do the best job I can at empowering and equipping them to best serve the children in our care, even if those are children I may never meet or may have very little contact with. Fourth, what's your temperament? I think it's good on a church staff to have that conversation amongst your team of what's your temperament. Are you introverts? Are you extroverts? Are you thinkers? Are you feelers? Whatever temperament instrument you like to use, it gives us a good vocabulary to try to understand each other better. And finally, what are your strengths? And there's a really great tool called the Clifton's Strengths Finder that I have found to be very helpful in using with my staff. We have a staff of a little over 100, and about 40 of them have taken the Clifton's Strength Finder. And it's given us a vocabulary to talk with one another and understand each other from a different perspective. It's called the Clifton's Strength Finder because Don Clifton was the guy who founded it. Who was Clifton? He was born in 1924. Well, what do we know about people who were born around 1924? They were drafted in World War II. And he was an Army Air Corps navigator. So he was the guy on the plane who figured out if the plane was going the right direction. And one time they thought the plane might be off course. And Clifton says that his gut told him they were exactly on the right course. But just to double check it, he did the math. And when he did the math, he realized that if they had stayed on that course, they were flying into enemy territory. And so he told the pilot to change course. The math overruled his intuition. And Clifton says that that was a revelation for him, that sometimes when we have data, data needs to trump our gut hunches. He learned from that experience to trust science more than intuition. After he finished his military service, Clifton went to college and studied psychology. And while he was studying psychology, he began to ask a simple question. The question he asked is, what if we understood people in light of what their strengths are, not what their pathologies are? Because psychology at that point was based on identifying people's anxieties and how those anxieties manifested and what we could do to relieve those anxieties. Clifton was one of the first guys to say, well, what if we don't look at the anxieties? What if we begin to look at the competencies? What if we begin to look at the strengths? As a graduate student, he started an institute for studying strengths. He defines talent as naturally recurring patterns of thought, feeling, or behavior that can be productively applied. Clifton was a devout Methodist, but as Christians, we believe talent to be given to us by God. God equips us with certain things literally from birth, and Clifton says by the time you're in high school, those talents, if you have invested in them, have become your strengths. So what are the strengths? Clifton defines strengths as talent times investment. So you've got your natural born talent that God gave you, was in place before you were ever born, and then you invest, you spend time, you develop that talent, and it becomes an innate strength. There are 34 of Clifton's strengths, and typically when someone takes the strengths inventory, you might be surprised that their first question is, what can I do to make my weaknesses into a strength? Clifton says that's not a real good investment of our time. He uses the parable of the metaphor of the scorpion and the frog. You've all heard this story. The scorpion and the frog are both standing by a riverbank one day, and the scorpion says, I really need to get to the other side of that river. And he asks the frog, can I ride on your back? And the frog says, absolutely not. You're a scorpion. You'll sting me. And the scorpion says, okay, let's think about this thing logically. If I'm on your back and I sting you, you're paralyzed, you sink, I sink, we both die. How does that make sense? And the frog, I don't know if frogs scratch their heads, but for the sake of conversation, frog scratches his head and he says, that makes sense. I'll give you right across the river. The scorpion gets on the frog's back. They begin to go across the river. They get about halfway across, and all of a sudden the scorpion takes his stinger and plants it into the frog as hard as he can. And the frog almost immediately begins to experience paralysis. He looks at the scorpion, and with his last breath, before he sinks to his death, he says, why? And the scorpion says, I'm a scorpion. It's in my nature. Clifton says what's in our nature we're not going to be able to change much. Once we achieve adulthood, our personality, our temperament, our strengths are pretty much set. And then we get to experience all of adulthood figuring out how to leverage our temperament, our personality, our strengths, and I would add our calling to maximize the kingdom impact that we can have during our very short time that we have on earth. Psalm 139, it's a psalm most of you know. Psalm 139 says that God knew us when we were in our mother's womb. He knitted us together. Luke 12, 6 through 7, Jesus is reminding the disciples that they should not be overly concerned about day-to-day things. And he says, God knows the number of hairs on your head. For some of us, that's not all that challenging. Some of you guys, it would take a while. If God knows the number of hairs on our head, if God knew us when we were being woven together in our mother's womb, does God ever look at us and go, I didn't know that about you? Does God ever look at a church staff that's assembled together and say, didn't see that one coming? God knows us, and he knows the teams that he assembles and that he calls us to be a part of. What we believe are coincidence and accidents is because we look at a very, very small picture. God sees the big picture, and he knows us. So if he knows our talents, if he assembled your team and equipped you with your strengths, there are no surprises. The only surprise, perhaps, is when we don't use our strengths as well as we could that he's equipped us with. Over 27 million have completed the Clifton Strengths Inventory, so the norming sample is really, really strong. Clifton says there are 4 domains of our strengths. So in a perfect world, if you have 4 domains of our strengths, and we take the strength inventory and it tells us where our strengths lie, what would you want to be the perfect profile? Well, you'd want to have 25% in each one of those domains. Nobody gets that. You'll never have a team with 25% in each domain. You'll never have an individual with 25% in each domain. But what are the 4 domains? The first is executing. The second is influencing others. The third is relationship building. And the fourth is strategic thinking. And what Clifton says is your strengths are going to be gathered in such a way that of those 34, you're going to have especially strengths clustered in 1 or 2 of those domains. Now, there are 34 strengths, but most of us use our top 5. Our top 5 strengths are our autopilot. Requires no effort. You don't think about it. It's just who you are and what you do. Most of the time, we can look at our top 10 and get a pretty good picture of someone's total strengths. I would suggest that in most church staffs and in most settings like this, you need to look at your top 15 because most of us have the 5 that we use with no effort whatsoever. The next 10 we can use pretty well. We're pretty flexible with that. We can adapt pretty well to different situations. Strength number 16 to strength number 29, they're just kind of placeholders. You can't use them easily, but they don't get in your way much either. Your bottom 5 strengths, number 30 through 34, I do think we need to pay attention to those because most of us will have some blind spots in our leadership, and we will find that those blind spots oftentimes correlate with our weakest strengths. For instance, in my life, harmony is not one of my top strengths. People who are especially gifted in harmony avoid conflict. They love it when people are all working together. They like to maintain the status quo. I don't like to maintain the status quo. I like to look at something and see how it could be better. Sometimes that will hurt people's feelings, and sometimes that will create disunity. I don't want to create disunity, but if that's the price I have to pay to pursue excellence, I will pursue excellence over maintaining harmony. So I need to know that because harmony is not one of my natural strengths, that when I'm leading my team, I need to be really careful how I say what I say, because I don't want to create disharmony just for the sake of the pursuit of excellence. I mentioned temperaments inventories earlier. DISC is probably my favorite of the temperament inventories. There are some correlations between DISC and Clifton's strengths, though they're not exactly parallel. Most of the people who have strengths, mostly in the strategic thinking area, are likely to be a D on the DISC, the decisive, determined, the one who likes to run things. People whose strengths are mostly in the influencing others domain may be in the I temperament category, influencing others, inspiring others. They like an audience. They like the opportunity to market. They're charismatic, commanding. They can work a room really, really well. People whose strengths are mostly in the relationship building domain are most likely to have the S temperament type. And people whose strengths are mostly in the executing domain may be more likely to have the C temperament type. So there is some parallel, but it's not exactly translatable. It's good to remember. So let's talk about the different domains. The executing domain has 9 separate strengths. Executing people are action-oriented. They're get-it-done people. It is vital to have people on your team who execute well. You can have the best strategist in the world. If that strategist doesn't know how to execute, or for whatever reason chooses not to execute, their strategies are virtually worthless. So it's great to have E people on your team. The 9 strengths that go with the executing domain are achiever, arranger, belief, consistency, deliberative, discipline, focus, responsibility, and restorative. Let me describe each of those real quickly. Achiever are people who are exceptionally talented, who work hard and possess a great deal of stamina. They take a lot of immense satisfaction in being busy and productive. It's good to have an achiever on your team. Arrangers can organize, but they also have a flexibility that complements their ability to organize. They like to determine how all the pieces and resources can be arranged for maximum productivity. Belief people have certain core values that are unchanging. Out of these values, they have a defined purpose for their lives. Consistency people are keenly aware of the need to treat people the same. They crave stable routines and clear rules and procedures that everyone can follow. Deliberative people, interestingly, in working with churches, I have found deliberative talent often being on the lower end. Deliberative people are really good at calculating risk and making decisions and choices. They anticipate obstacles. They are risk managers. That oftentimes doesn't fit well with ministry because any kind of ministry brings with it an inordinate amount of risk. And if you are hyper vigilant to avoid risk, you can paralyze a ministry. Discipline, people who are especially talented in the discipline theme enjoy routine and structure. Their world is best described by the order they create. Focused people can take a direction, follow through, and make corrections necessary to stay on track. They prioritize and then they act. Responsibility people take psychological ownership of what they say they will do. They're committed to stable values such as honesty and loyalty. And restorative people are really, really good problem solvers. They can look at what's wrong and figure out a way to fix it. Restorative is also not one of my greatest strengths. I was having a conversation with one of my employees one day, and we were talking about problem solving, and I said to him, I like to solve problems. I love to prevent problems. Restorative is not my greatest strength. Strategic thinking is one of my greater strengths. I like to think about how we can not have problems. I don't always like to have to come in and solve the problems, especially if they're not of my own making. The influencing domain has 8 strengths. The influencing domain is very social oriented. They're asking, how can I engage my network? Influencing people are charismatic. They're great marketers. They're great salespeople. You want to be around them. When they describe the newest ministry opportunity, people catch their vision very, very easily. There are 8 strengths in the influencing domain: activator, command, communication, competition, maximizer, self-assurance, significance, and WOO, which is an acronym for winning others over. I will never understand why they didn't name that persuasive or something. WOO seems like a silly name to give a strength. But the people I know who have it love the name of it as well. Activator people, people who are especially talented in the activator theme, can make things happen. They turn thoughts into action. They want to do things now rather than simply talk about them. They can be impatient. Command people have presence. They take control of a situation. They're never afraid to make decisions. Communication people, people especially talented in the communication theme, generally find it easy to put their thoughts into words. They're good conversationalists. They're very good presenters. People exceptionally talented in the competition theme measure their progress against the performance of others. They strive to win first place. They revel in contests. People exceptionally talented in the maximizer theme focus on strengths as a way to stimulate personal and group excellence. They seek to transform something strong into something superb. It's great to have a maximizer on your team. It can be exhausting to have a maximizer on your team because a maximizer is never going to say, hey, this is good enough. They are always looking for how can it be better? How can we make this good thing a great thing? How can we make this great thing a perfect thing? And even when you're doing really, really well, the maximizer is always saying, but could we do more? People exceptionally talented in the self-assurance theme feel confident in their ability to take risks and manage their own lives. They have an inner compass that gives them certainty in their decisions. People exceptionally talented in the significance theme want to make a big impact. They're independent. They prioritize projects based on how much influence they'll have on the organization they're in or the people around them. And the WOO people, and among our team, whenever we say WOO, we have to raise our hands. The WOO people. People especially talented in the WOO theme love the challenge of meeting new people and winning them over. They derive satisfaction from breaking the ice and making a connection with someone. You put a WOO person in a room, and they will begin to immediately, instinctively network. They'll find out all the people they know that somebody else knows, what they have in common with everybody in the room. And when they leave that room, they're energized. They're ready to go do more. It's a great, great gift to have. The relationship building domain also has 9 strengths: adaptability, connectedness, developer, empathy, harmony, includer, individualization, positivity, and relator. People exceptionally talented in the adaptability theme, they like to go with the flow. They tend to be now people, and they take things as they come and discover the future one day at a time. People exceptionally talented in the connectedness theme see a big picture than most people do. They have faith in the links among all things. They think there are few coincidences, and almost every event has some significant meaning. Developer people, people exceptionally talented in the developer theme, recognize and cultivate the potential in others. They spot the signs of each small improvement, and they derive satisfaction from evidence of progress. The greatest challenge, if you are gifted in the developer area, it's a challenge, it's a reward. If you see potential in someone and you help craft their skill set within that potential, and they do indeed grow, what often happens? They go somewhere else. The difference is the developer gets excited to see them go somewhere else. They never feel like that was wasted investment. It's good to see people grow. People exceptionally talented in the empathy theme can sense other people's feelings by imagining themselves in others' lives or situations. People exceptionally talented in the harmony theme look for consensus. They don't enjoy conflict, and they seek areas of agreement. People exceptionally talented in the includer theme accept others. They show awareness of those who feel left out, and they make an effort to include them. My top strength is this next one, individualization. People exceptionally talented in the individualization theme are intrigued with the unique qualities of each person. They have a gift for figuring out how different people can work together productively. It is my hunch that the reason individualization is such a great strength for me is because everything about me hates the idea of one size fits all. Because if one size is supposed to fit all, it never fits me. Whether it's an airplane seat or an article of clothing, a free t-shirt that you might get somewhere, if it says one size fits all, I know that I have to give it to somebody else who's built more like the all people. People exceptionally talented in the positivity theme have contagious enthusiasm. They're upbeat and can get others excited about what they're going to do. I imagine positivity people walking around with balloons all the time, ready to give you a balloon and tell you how glad they are that we're going to do this next thing. And sometimes if your strength is in the strategic area, it's your job to pop the balloons because it's not time to do that just yet. Relator people are exceptionally talented in the close relationship with others. They find deep satisfaction in working hard with friends to achieve a goal. And the final domain is the strategic thinking domain. It has 8 strengths: analytical, context, futuristic, ideation, input, intellection, learner, and strategic. And we'll talk about each one of those real quickly. People exceptionally talented in the analytical theme search for reasons and causes. They have the ability to think about all facets and all the factors that might affect a situation. They're really good at cause and effect. People exceptionally talented in the context theme enjoy thinking about the past. They understand the present by researching its history. Have you ever been at a church that's so fixated on its history it can't move forward? Probably they have a lot of people with strong context strength. And for them, the thought of letting go of what has been is overwhelming. Finding ways to help them connect with people who are future-oriented can be really valuable. The next strategic thing is futuristic. People exceptionally talented in the futuristic theme are inspired by the future and what could be. They energize others with their visions of the future. People exceptionally talented in the ideation theme are fascinated by ideas. They're able to find connections between seemingly disparate phenomena. People exceptionally talented in the input theme have a need to collect and archive. They may accumulate informations, artifacts, or relationships. Have you ever known somebody that if you talk with them about a problem, they reach into a file and they pull out an article? I read this 4 years ago, and I think it speaks to exactly what you're discussing. Or I read a book 2 weeks ago, or I heard an interview or a podcast. I want you to go to this resource. I want you to meet with this person. I want you to read this article. I want you to visit this location, and that will give you the insight. Those are input people. Intellection people are characterized by their intellectual activity. They're introspective, and they appreciate intellectual discussions. People exceptionally talented in the learner theme have a great desire to learn, and they want to continuously improve. The process of learning, rather than the outcome, excites them. People exceptionally talented in the strategic theme create alternative ways to proceed. Faced with any given scenario, they can quickly spot the relevant patterns and issues. I want to do an exercise with you real quickly, and I'm going to admit right up front, this exercise is full of hyperbole. It will never, ever, ever happen. But let's say you had a church staff of 4 people. And among that church staff of 4 people, one of those people, all 5 of their greatest strengths are in the executing domain. And the second person, all 5 of their greatest strengths are in the influencing other domain. And the third person, all 5 of their greatest strengths are in the relationship building domain. And finally, the fourth person, all 5 of their greatest strengths are in the analytical thinking or strategic thinking domain. And those 4 people are working together, and they identify a problem in the church. And they come up with a plan of how to solve that problem, and they all agree on the plan. They all agree what the problem is. They all agree with the desired outcome. And then each of them, using their own strengths, sets about trying to solve those problems. What do you think those 4 people think about each other? So here's my proposal to you. The person with all the strength in the executing domain looks at the other 3 and says, if these guys weren't so lazy, we could do this thing. But none of them are willing to do anything. The one with all the strengths in the influencing others domain looks at the other three and says, if they had more charisma, if they could get the congregation excited, we could solve this problem. The one with the relationship building strength looks at the other three and says, if those three guys were more relational, if they understood the importance of connecting with people one-on-one and knowing their history and bringing them along, we could solve that problem. And the strategic thinking person looks at the other three and says, if those guys were smarter, we could solve all these problems. Now, the reality is you're never going to have a church staff where the divisions are that clean. I am excited to tell you, where I work at the children's home, we have 5 key senior leaders, and we have a representative of each one of the domains. We have 2 relationship builders. We have a strategic thinker. We have an influencing other. We have someone who executes. Of my strengths profile, execution is my weakest area. So I can come up with a strategy. But then if it's up to me to make sure that strategy gets implemented, measured, taken care of on a daily basis, you are probably going to be disappointed. So recently I was looking for someone to fill a position as my assistant. And I'm thrilled to tell you that my assistant is a really strong executor. So she makes sure that the day-to-day stuff gets done. All the reports are ready. All the PowerPoints looked correct. There aren't misspelled words. That's not even on my radar screen. By the time you execute the strategy I've come up with, I have moved on to another strategy and another problem that I'm trying to solve. And I kind of get bored with the execution part. It's vitally important. I'm really glad that we have executors on our team, but I'm not a strong executor. I'm a pretty strong strategic thinker, and I'm pretty good with relationship building. Not as good with influencing others, and executing is really significantly lower than the other 3. So what I would suggest to you, especially with a church body setting, number 1, I would say to you that your church will become what your staff is being. Your church is oftentimes, the congregation is a reflection of what's going on in your staff. So if you have a conflicted, divided, disunitied staff, you will oftentimes see a conflicted, divided, disunited congregation. The interesting thing is, if we took those 4 hypothetical church leaders and they were thinking in terms of what's my strength and what's your strength, then the strategist might be the one who put a lot of energy into coming up with the plan to solve the problem. And the influencing others person might have a lot of energy for casting that vision to the congregation and helping them get excited about what they're going to do. And the relationship building person is looking throughout that congregation to know who they need to equip to do what part to solve that problem. And the executor is there to say, this week we have to do this, and next week we have to do that, and 3 weeks from now we have to do that, and a month from now we have to do that, and that's how we're going to make this problem lead to the desired outcomes. But if we don't have the vocabulary to talk about our strengths and to understand the strengths of others, it can create what feels like conflict, what feels like tension. It is not tension. It is not conflict. It's different people with different strengths trying to work together. So part of what I recommend to organizations and to churches is to consider using something like a strengths inventory. Do it for yourself first and see what your results look like. Then think about doing it with your key leaders and identify folks on your staff or even in your congregation who might be able to do their job more effectively, leverage their talents, leverage their strengths for kingdom impact, if they have the ability to talk with one another with a vocabulary that's a strengths-oriented vocabulary, not a deficit-oriented vocabulary. We tend to see our own strengths, but sometimes we focus on other people's weaknesses. What happens in a church if everyone is looking at everyone's strengths, identifying the challenges, identifying the obstacles they want to overcome, and then working together as a team and allowing people to use their greatest strength in the way that has the greatest impact. I would love to be a part of a church like that, and I've had the privilege of working with some churches and doing this with their ministerial teams so they can begin to see how can we talk to each other and how can we talk to our staff or our members in such a way that really grows their strengths. At this point, I would be happy to take any questions we have. Any questions about the Strengths Finder or how to use that in the ministry setting?
Yes, sir. You mentioned updating job descriptions.
Yes.
How often do you recommend that you update job descriptions with your staff?
I think it makes sense to do it annually because you're probably going to do an annual evaluation anyway. And the annual evaluation is a great time to have that conversation. And so if you're the senior pastor, to say to your student minister, you've done a great job this year, but I've noticed we haven't put as much energy into discipling our high schoolers. So for the next 12 months, let's make that part of your focus. And I want you to spend at least 25% of your time focusing on that. And you kind of rewrite the job description. I always say to my staff at that point, if we're going to rewrite your job description, you need to make sure it's a good fit for you. If it is not a good fit for you, I need to assign that to someone else or recognize that you're not going to be able to fit that role. We may have to look for somebody else to fit that role, either internally or externally.
And then your follow-up, let's say you're having difficulty with a staff member that's having difficulty accomplishing some of these tasks that you, is there any resource that you'd recommend, a book or philosophy on not micromanaging them, but how do you manage them?
Sure. I think StrengthsFinder can be real useful for that. Because if you've assigned someone a high priority of something that's not their strength, they're not likely to be able to achieve it at the level that you want it to be achieved. And so at that point, if you're asking a scorpion to act like it's not a scorpion, that's probably going to be pretty frustrating for you and for the scorpion. So if they're not able to achieve because they don't have the strength set to accomplish those goals, you can mentor them, help them grow in areas where they need to find growth. The great thing about a church setting is you might have somebody in the congregation who could be a volunteer that's really gifted in an area they're not gifted in, and you can deputize that person. So if you have a really good student minister, but they're not an executor, they're a great strategic thinker, they're great at influencing others, they're really good at relationship building, they just don't get their receipts turned in on time. They don't always start when they say they're going to start. They tend to cancel things because they didn't do the planning to make it happen effectively. Well, if you've got someone on the team of student leaders who's an exceptional executor, you can deputize that person to be the support for your leader so your leader grows in their strengths, but things don't fall through the gaps because you've got somebody else doing the day-to-day detail that has to be done. And oftentimes in a church setting, that person can be a volunteer, which that also is an attractive option.
Thank you.
Certainly. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Would you agree with Clifton that at a certain point in adulthood, you're pretty much set, so there's no need to retake the test every few years, or would there be any benefit in that?
I would agree to that with a asterisk, with a little disclaimer. I think if you have had a significant life event, whatever that might be, religious conversion could be one, medical crisis could be one, significant loss could be one, then you can have some change in temperament and change in strengths. I think for most of us, by the time you're at your mid-20s, you're not going to see a lot of change from then on. I've talked to people who have taken the Clifton Strengths multiple times, and they do say that sometimes their top 5, the order in which they occur will be different, but it's rare that anything that's not in their top 10 would ever show up in their top 5. And it's rare that their bottom 5 ever becomes anything other than their bottom 5. We do have a tendency to look at that bottom 5 and try to figure out how can I come up with a strategy to change that. I want that to be a strength. And you can. You can invest hours and hours of energy and a lot of dollars, and you can turn that weakness into an average. You can turn it into something mediocre. Or you can take that same amount of energy and that same amount of strength and focus on what your strengths are and turn them into super strengths and really be effective at what you do. So I look at the bottom 5 as blind spots. I need to know they're there. I don't need to get my feelings hurt if somebody points out that that's a blind spot, but I'm not ever going to make it one of my top 5 strengths.
Follow-up question. A lot of churches are single staff churches. You've got one pastor. We were talking before about the conflicts sometimes that develop. Do you think a lot of those conflicts are simply because of the differences that pastor, their strengths, their leadership styles, versus the people who are viewing it?
I think that is one possible source of the conflict, or what feels like conflict. I'm not sure it's always conflict. If the pastor can enhance their vocabulary and look at members in terms of seeing what their strengths are, whether they use Clifton strengths or not is peripheral. But if we can look at people, what do they bring to the table? How can we leverage that for increasing the kingdom impact of this congregation? And we all feel like we're on the same team, working for the same purpose, and have a constructive vocabulary for when we have different ideas about how to achieve the desired outcomes. I think that feels a lot different than I want it my way and you want it your way, and we're just never going to see eye to eye, so we'll agree to disagree. I think that's a recipe for ministerial burnout. Other questions? It has been a delight to be with you today. Thank you so much. And if I can offer any other information, I'm glad to stick around.